So the U.S. intelligence chief held talks with President Moon Jae-in and Washington's top nuclear negotiators, sending out warnings to North Korea almost every day, while also convincing the North to make the right choice. But all eyes are on U.S. President Trump, as his lips remain tightly sealed 3 weeks after the Hanoi summit. Now, to tell us more on Trump's motives and Washington's post-Hanoi diplomatic tactics, we now connect with Dr. James Kim at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for your time, Dr. Kim.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start off by talking a little bit about President Moon Jae-in's meeting with visiting U.S. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats. How do you assess the significance and the outcome of the talks, although not much has been revealed?
Well, last time the Director of National Intelligence from the United States visited South Korea was in May 2016. Then Director James Clapper visited Seoul. And it was very similar issues having to do with North Korea. But this time around, I believe it has more to do with information sharing as well as coordination on negotiations with North Korea, and coordinations in particular between the United States and South Korea. So to some extent, I think it was an opportune time, given that the North Koreans haven't responded yet since Hanoi about working level meetings for the South Korean administration as well as the Director of National Intelligence to talk about what the next steps may be.
Now, Mr. Dan Coats is known to be a hardliner on North Korea. He has previously stated that North Korea is unlikely to give up its nuclear ambitions because, quote, its leaders ultimately view nuclear weapons as critical to regime survival. Now, why do you think South Korean government invited such person at such a critical time?
Well, the statement, I think, was in reference to the intelligence estimate that was released earlier this year, where both, it wasn't just Dan Coats, but all of the intelligence community together came up with the consensus report on the outlook about North Korea's willingness to give up on its nuclear ambitions. But, you know, that's an intelligence estimate per se. In terms of the actual position that Director Coats has about pushing forward on negotiations with North Korea, I believe it's in line with the Trump administration's approach, which is to maintain an open stance on future negotiations. So while, you know, some people may characterize Dan Coats as a hawk, overall I think he is maintaining the administration's position on this issue. And to a large extent, again, given that North Korea hasn't responded yet, I think President Moon thought that this was an opportune time to coordinate on information sharing and cooperation with the United States next steps in the negotiations with North Korea. So overall, given the circumstances, it's a very good moment to readjust and reassess how South Korea may move forward with the United States.
So it was a good opportunity for information sharing and coordination. So the U.S. intelligence chief has visited Seoul, while U.S. National Security Advisor Bolton as well as U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo are sending out warnings to North Korea almost on a daily basis. But President Trump remains silent. Your thoughts on that?
Well, ever since the Hanoi summit and the press conference that President Trump had related to his meeting with Kim Jong-un, the ball really is on the North Korean side of the court at the moment. Kim Jong-un himself hasn't responded in terms of what the next steps will be. I believe the President Trump, as well as the follow-up meetings by Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, as well as the principal head negotiator on the U.S. side, Stephen Biegun, has made clear that they are waiting for the North Koreans to respond at the working level meeting so that they could push ahead with the negotiations. But, you know, we've had, aside from the public statements by Choi Sun-hee, we haven't had any statements related to this position that the United States has, whether the North Koreans would like to move forward with the working level negotiations or whether they would like to break the talks and go their own way. So it's not clear at the moment what North Korea's position is, and so I believe President Trump is waiting for Kim Jong-un to respond to his overtures.
So Mr. President is remaining silent, but also North Korean leader, we must not forget, is also being silent for the time being. Now, CNN has reported that the Trump administration is now discussing how to respond if North Korea launches a satellite. Does this mean that Washington is now bracing for North Korea's provocation?
Well, given that we're finding some, evidence based on some signal intelligence coming from satellite imagery photos, that activity has resumed at the Dongchangli site, the United States, I believe, is taking all precautionary measures so as not to be blindsided by, an unexpected behavior by North Korea. So provocation, while likelihood being low, has still got to be on the table, and it's one that the United States is obviously considering, and they're trying to see if North Korea provocates what their response is going to be. So it's good that the U.S. is preparing for this. I believe South Korea should also be preparing for these low likely scenarios. But nonetheless, I still think that the likelihood is relatively low, given that all the signals outside of Choi Sun-yi's public statement is that North Korea is still interested in coming to the bargaining table and negotiating on this issue.
Now, according to Time, President Trump has blocked top negotiator Stephen Biegun from re-establishing a back channel with North Korea through the North's United Nations mission in New York. The report, of course, needs further verification, but what do you think is Trump's motive behind such a move?
I think your point about verification on that report is critical. We don't have confirmation by the major news outlets and the media. Certainly, there's no confirmation from the Trump administration and the State Department about this. So I'm not sure where this information is coming from. But even if the report is true, there's more than one channel by which the United States can reach out to Pyongyang. And, we've seen this before with Kim Yong-chol's visit to Washington. We've had high-level ranking officials visiting Pyongyang from Washington. But, an easy one would be one through South Korea. As we know, there's ongoing meetings and visits happening on both sides, as we've seen with Director Coates coming to Seoul. We see some working level folks from Seoul visiting Washington. There's no reason why the meetings, the message from Washington can't be relayed to Pyongyang through Seoul. So there are other channels here, and it's not clear to me why President Trump would be blocking that channel at the UN if that in fact is true. So I'd have to wait and see whether this is the case. But as I've said before, the official position from the United States is that all channels for dialogue are still open.
All channels for dialogue are still open. Now, situations are not so favorable for U.S. President Trump at home. Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election is reportedly nearing an end. How would the investigation results affect Mr. Trump's North Korea diplomacy?
Obviously, if President Trump is embroiled in domestic scandals and political troubles, then a lot of that energy and time is going to be taken away from foreign policy for him to focus more on the domestic issues. So as we get closer to the election in 2020, we need to be mindful about the impact that these domestic political factors will play in to President Trump's time and also his energies. And if he's going to be more focused on these domestic issues, clearly he's going to have less time for issues related to foreign policy, including North Korea. So overall, it isn't really good. And as we get closer to the election in 2020, there's less time here for North Korea to really see some results on these negotiations. So they need to come out quickly out of their shell and engage with the United States.
North Korea has called back its ambassadors to China, Russia, and the United Nations, plus a few other overseas missions to Pyongyang. Is this a rare case, and what do you think is the motive behind such move?
Well, we've seen this before, and Choi Sun-hee apparently is involved in some way. It seems to me that ever since May of last year, immediately before the Singapore summit, Choi Sun-hee has been designated as a sort of a public diplomacy spokesperson for Pyongyang. And she's been out and about speaking freely. But we've heard this kind of rhetoric before. I think John Bolton has stated as much, and Mike Pompeo as well. But until we hear directly from Kim Jong-un that this is what, in fact, he thinks about these negotiations, the U.S. is going to stay the course on this and not get sidetracked by these statements by certain officials like Choi Sun-hee. So overall, I think we'll hear from North Korea on what these announcements are. But until it comes from the chairman himself, I don't think it's going to carry much weight at the moment.
So we'll have to wait and see. Rhetoric between North Korea and the U.S. appears to be getting stronger, and that was apparent at the UN Disarmament Conference on Tuesday. Now, are we now facing a long-term nuclear impasse between the two sides?
Well, as I've said before, the U.S. position on this is fairly clear. They still want to talk, but everything depends on North Korea. So we'll have to wait and see. But these kinds of fiery rhetoric that we've seen from certain officials from Pyongyang is not something that's new. This is almost par for the course when it comes to North Korea. We've seen this kind of messaging before. We expect to see more. But if this is short of any act of provocation or a specific statement directly from Kim Jong-un's mouth, the U.S. administration is not going to take these statements seriously. So currently at the moment, Washington's position is that they will wait this out, and they're going to wait and see how long it takes for North Korea to respond, and hopefully they won't take longer than they need to. We expect to see some kind of response within the next month or two.
Now, many believe that at the heart of this nuclear impasse between Pyongyang and Washington is the sequencing problem of dismantling North Korea's nuclear programs. What do you think is the most viable solution to this?
Well, you know, one approach that the U.S. has staked out is to have a comprehensive agreement. And there's a potential here for a phase-staged approach as long as sanctions is not part of that phase-staged approach. That sanctions is the last step in that phase-staged, stage-by-stage agreement. So on the implementation side, sanctions will have to come at the very end of that agreement. But initially, there are other things that the U.S. is willing to put on the table. As we've heard, some rumors coming out of Hanoi was, you know, liaison offices, along with people-to-people exchanges, cultural exchanges, potential here for an end-of-war declaration or some kind of a peace regime, or work towards peaceful regime, and work towards normalizing relations between North Korea and the United States. So there are a lot of things outside of sanctions that the U.S. is willing to put on table, but sanctions only has to come at the very end of that process. So the question here is whether or not North Korea wants to play along with this demand. If not, what they're willing to offer to the first part of this demand, if anything at all. So until we hear from Pyongyang, it's not clear whether this is going to be a viable approach or it isn't. From what we've heard in Hanoi, they're not interested in this approach. Again, now they need to reassess. Do they go their own path, or do they continue down this road of negotiating with the United States and try to get something out of it in the interim? So again, we have to wait and see because we haven't heard from Pyongyang yet.
All right, Dr. Kim, I guess we'll have to keep a close eye on how things unfold from this point on. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thanks for having me.